Okay, since the last video, obviously I've gotten the assembly done and I've primed it. I primed it in Badger Stynylrez Gray primer. This is actually the second version of part 3 of this series. I had pretty much gotten it painted in the two-tone desert camouflage that I had originally talked about, and I had some issues with the stripes, and long story short, I decided to completely change direction, stripped that paint back, primed it down again, and I'm going to be doing one that's olive drab over neutral gray. I'm going to be doing this one right here. I know this isn't in color, but the darker color is olive drab. The lower part of the fuselage is a neutral gray. These decals are from Super Scale, and that right there is the marking set that I'll be using on this model. So let me take this into my paint room, my airbrush room, which for some reason my wife calls the laundry room. Not sure why, but I'll take it in there, and I'm going to paint the undersides neutral gray, and then I'll show you some steps I'm going to take to kind of make the paint look distressed. Okay, I promise I airbrushed this. I know it looks the same as in the last shot. I actually used Vallejo neutral gray and gave it a fairly good coat. The reason I did it, even though it's, if you look, I don't even know if it'll show up on camera, but this is the primer, this is the paint down on the lower side and up under here. I can see the difference here in person. I don't know if it'll show up on camera. The reason I went ahead and painted it with that and didn't just leave it in the primer is if I have to go back and touch up something by hand later on, I just want to make sure it matches, even though there's going to be weathering and all sorts of nonsense on it. So for what it's worth, it's been painted neutral gray. Now what I want to do next is I want to simulate the distressing that happens to paint on these combat aircraft. And if you've ever looked at a photo of any old combat aircraft, but specifically anything from the U.S. that was neutral gray and OD green, the paints would fade, they would get spots, there would be all of this uneven wear. It wasn't necessarily chipping, but rather just the process that it goes through of, mud gets splashed up under it, it goes flying through a rainstorm, there's rain on the ground, there's sun on the ground, there's heat, there's reflected light, there's UV going on, there's all sorts of things going on. And both on the top side and the underside, it would fade the paint, it would spot the paint, it would, there would be areas that would get stains. And so to kind of start it moving in that direction, even though this isn't the official weathering phase, to start it moving in that direction, I want to go ahead and do a few steps to get that process going. Now in my palette, I've got a mix of about 3 parts sky gray, 1 part neutral gray, and I've thinned it down, I would just say heavily, but if you're, wanting, I don't have a specific ratio, I didn't count, but I would say it's at least more water than paint, not by a huge amount. If you want me to give it a number, 60% water, 40% paint, but that's just a guess, because as you know, 63.5% of all statistics are made up on the spot. But I'm just going to use this extra large dry brush from Rosemary & Co. And I'm just going to go in and I'm going to start doing this all over the bottom of the aircraft. Now, it's going to make it look like it's got measles, but that's okay. And if you don't have a brush like this, then certainly, hang on. If you have a makeup brush like this, or a big brush like this, or even if you want to get, your some sponge, a piece of sponge in your forceps, or just hold on to it. Anything to just give it a distressed pattern like this. I like using this dry brush because with a very light touch, I can kind of keep it random, and I'm just slowly rotating the brush around. I'm not too worried if it gets a bit of a stamp effect, because what I'll do is I'll go over this with a very low opacity coat of the neutral gray again, which will blend it back, and you'll see the result. I like the result. Now, you can, for this type of thing, in the past when I've used to do aircraft and even non-aircraft models, you can do post shading and what I call post fading, where you use a lighter color. Some folks do that to color in kind of the middle of the panels. I never really liked doing it that way. I tended to just do what I call scribbling, where I would get this lighter color and just go all around the surface with my airbrush, just in a manner like that, just very light, very thin coats. But to my eye, this type of technique comes closest to replicating what I've seen in real life. I know I've seen other modelers do it, but the first time I saw it, noted it, and asked the question, how did you do that, was a modeler who is, I think, one of the best modelers I've ever known, a fellow named Steve Budd, lives in the UK, and he writes for, don't know if he still does, because I haven't read many magazines in the last few years, but he wrote for Airfix Model World, and just did some outstanding builds for them. And I had the pleasure I have the pleasure of knowing him personally, and I haven't talked to him in a long time, but he did some techniques on the underside of a model a long time ago, and I just looked at it and I thought, that is really, really innovative and looks really, really good. And at the time, I didn't fully grasp how he was doing it. But as I've spent the last few years working on sci-fi, and especially gaming minis, and making use of dry brushes and stippling and things like that, then I better understood what I had seen him do. So, as with any technique we use, there's probably lots of people who use them, but I remember Steve with that one. So, Steve, if you happen to be watching this, thank you, and I hope I'm doing this in a way that you would go, yeah, he got it, or something close to it. Anyway, there are plenty of ways to introduce paint distressing onto a model, so I am not saying this is the way. As I've said before, I'm not the Mandalorian. I'm not going to say this is the way on something like this. I'm going to say this is a way. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do the same thing, just with the sky gray by itself. Again, heavily watered down. I'm going to do it just a little more sparingly. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference. But if you're doing a YouTube video, sounds really impressive to say that you're doing a multi-tonal distressed finish. Seriously though, using additional colors, you know, something that maybe leans into the blue side of the spectrum a little bit, something that maybe even lighter than this, closer to white, maybe in a few places leaning into a darker color, you know, something like that. Just something that introduces some tonal variety can really set off the finish. And it works well if you experiment with this, that you combine techniques. So you could, you know, do this type of technique and then do that more traditional scribbling method that I talked about. You know, you could do one first and then the other, or the other way around, however. So certainly combining techniques is a good thing. One other note, because I always forget this, so I will bring it up. Don't forget that if you have anything hanging under the aircraft, like the extra fuel tank or the landing gear doors, don't forget to include those in this process. One other quick thought: if you are brush painting your models, if you don't use an airbrush, and you'd be surprised how many people contact me and say that they don't use an airbrush on their models, either because they just don't see the point, don't see the necessity, don't have the money, don't have the time, don't want to be bothered, whatever, which I understand. When I got into sci-fi and started doing brush painting more, I find myself airbrushing less and less. I enjoy brush painting. But anyway, if you are brush painting and you don't already know this, you can do the similar kind of effect by doing this stippling, and then over that, just glaze thin layers of the base paint, and you can get a very similar, if not duplicate, effect to what I've got going on here. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to take my original neutral gray and I'm going to thin it way down, and I'm just going to start airbrushing it on, just kind of in a mist-like fashion, until I get it to the what I call the TLAR point. That looks about right. And when it's knocked back enough, then and it's blended enough, knowing one of the things I try to take into account when I'm doing that blending layer is that I will add additional layers of weathering later on down the road, which will tone that effect down even more. So I try to hit a balance of having it look good now, but still having it stark enough that after the additional layers of weathering are put on, that it will still kind of come through and it will all work together. Because that's really what I'm doing as I'm working on this, is I'm not thinking just necessarily what's the next step, but what's the end game. So let me go get that airbrushed on. Okay, you can see what that looks like when I blended it back. And I didn't totally cover it up. I'm actually worried that I blended it back a little too much. I'm worried that with the later effects it may disappear more than I want, but so be it. Not too worried about it. But what I'm going to do, because I used water-based acrylics, which when they cure, they're very durable, but you do have to take a little more precaution with them than, say, lacquers or hybrid lacquers like Tamiya acrylics when you're masking them. So I'm going to give this a little time to dry, and then I'll mask it off and get the upper surfaces painted olive drab. All right, I'm ready to get the lower portions masked off so that I can apply the upper color. For this masking, I'm going to use just Tamiya tape, but certainly over the years I have used masking fluid for certain things. I've used poster putty for masking. I've done freehand. I've used other kinds of films and things like parafilm. There's a lot of different ways to do masking. You can, I don't do this very often because I think the end results are just a little more, they're okay, but for all the work you put into it, I don't think it's that much different than doing it these other ways. But I've cut out the pattern from a scaled up set of the instructions and used something like blue tack or tape underneath it to hold it in place. That can work too. But the main thing is masking off the areas that you don't want painted so that you can paint the areas that you do want painted. The main consideration that I always think about is the angle of my airbrush. So for example, we will pretend that this is my airbrush right here. And so as I'm airbrushing it, like for example, if I'm airbrushing along this side right here, then I have to be aware that if I'm airbrushing along here and I need to get under here, well, overspray might be able to get under there. Or if I don't mask off the undersurface of the horizontal stabilizer it can get up under there as well. Same way if you're spraying the leading edges. Sometimes you have to get at a very shallow angle to successfully spray the leading edges along here to get them down as far as the aircraft may require. And that overspray can hit well back over here as you're moving your airbrush around. So I always have to consider what are the angles going to be and how can I account for that. So a lot of that is just common sense as you're looking at the model and as you're looking at your masking, but certainly some of it comes from experience. Now when it comes to using tape, I certainly want to avoid any of the paint lifting off. So I do several things to help me unmask the model after I've got everything painted. One, I try to remember on most pieces of tape to fold over a little bit of a tab so that instead of having to scratch with my fingernail to try and get the tape up, I've got one end that's just not sticking down, and I can use that as a pull tab. The other thing I do is I detack the tape. You can do this on your model workbench. You can do this. I just do this on my finger and count on a little bit of oil from my hand, getting on there to just remove some of the tackiness. I still find that no matter how much I detack it, when I go to pull the tape off, it never seems like it's enough. It's a hard line to balance between sufficiently tacky to stay down there and withstand the airbrush blowing on it, and yet not so tacky that it sticks and lifts things up. But I tend to just, I guess you'd say, exaggerate my masking. Like here, I'm going to put it on right there so it's got a good solid anchor point. And then I'm just going to bring it, whoops, I guess it would help if I'm on camera. And then I'm just going to bring it up and kind of visually follow the curve of the underside. And then there's a little bit of a wrinkle right there, so I just smoothed that out. You can smooth out some wrinkles with Tamiya tape. If you put wide curves on it, it doesn't work as well. You might have to go to, I forgot to show this, you might have to go to some kind of curve tape like that. But a lot of times with curves like that, that's where I'll actually cut out certain shapes or use masking fluid or something like that. All right, I've masked off this area here where there's the transition between the horizontal stabilizer and the rudder and the underside. But on most P-39s, there was some curve right there. I think these were actually painted with an air gun freehand. because you see a little bit of a feathered edge on most aircraft, but I'm not going to try and replicate that in this scale. But I wanted just a little bit of a curve here. Now, there's several ways of doing this. I could use some curve tape, but for that kind of curve, it's a little small. What happened to my nose there? It's a little small to make it work there. I could use liquid mask. That would work just fine. No problem with that. Just kind of paint in a little swoop there. That's easy enough to do. But what I am going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of tape. Now I'll start by detacking the tape, because since it's a little bigger piece when it's all together, it makes it easier to detack. And if the question you might have is, how many times do you detack it? It's not a fixed number of times. It's by the sound. I listen. If you do it, you'll hear the sound of less stickiness. And I just listen for a certain sound, and best I can tell you is that just comes through experience. So build more models. Now that angle there is roughly a 90-degree angle, not quite, but fairly close. So I'm going to try and account for it mostly. All I'm going to do is I'm going to use this little grid here on my, let me use this one up here. I'm going to use this little grid here on my desk, and I'm going to put the piece of tape there, and then I'm going to just kind of guess the angle as on the underside is about, come on, you cooperate, is about that. We'll call that close enough for government work. And then I'm just going to cut starting here, and then I'm just going to draw it around here like this, and just flatten it out so that it intersects with that first line right there. And then this right here will be my mask right there. Now the alignment, when you've got giant ham-fisted fingers like me, can be a little tricky. And then I'll just take this and kind of just use the tip of my knife to just kind of coax it around. I got a little more of a curve than I wanted in it right there. A little more of a wrinkle. But all I'll do is I'll get it close enough, and then I'll just flatten that down. And once all the weathering's applied, I'll call that close enough. So let me get the rest of the model masked, and I'll show it to you when it's done, and then I'll move on to putting on the top color. Okay, you can see how I've got the underside masked off there, so it's ready for painting on the top. Now what I did on the upper surface, I went ahead and painted the wing walks because it's easier to get those painted than to do it after painting the olive drab. So I went ahead and painted it on there, and then I'll mask it off, and then I can paint over it. But all I did, very simple, I did a base coat of NATO Black from Vallejo Model Air, and once I got that on there, and I just sprayed it. I sprayed it enough to make sure that it went wider than the masking area needed to be. And then once I did that, I took some black gray RLM 66, and using a little sponge in a paint protector tube, I just sponged that on, and it just moves it towards the weathering. I'm going to do more weathering on it later, but it just moves it along towards that, and it makes sure that initial weathering is confined to the area that I'm going to mask off. So just kind of helps me along for the steps that come later. So the next step is to get the olive drab on. Okay, as you can see, I've got the upper surfaces painted in an olive drab color. I ended up using olive drab base from AK Interactive. It's one of their 3rd generation paints. All your base art belong to us. So I've got that on there now. I want to do some paint distressing. Now to start the paint distressing, I'm going to use this Brownish Green, also from AK. I've got a set from AK that's an olive drab set. It's 4 paints, 3 of which go together and 1 which is completely weird. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. And as I did on the underside, I'm going to use this large dry brush. I'm just going to get a little paint in it, dab it off like this on the paper towel, and then just start applying this all over. Now I'm going to be fairly heavy with this in terms of application, because in studying original color photos of P-39 in the Southwest Pacific, where this one that I'm modeling operated, they got very, very faded, and the paint was just really, really beat up looking. So much so that I was looking at it going, how am I going to actually replicate this? It's certainly not going to be replication. It's going to be simulation. I mean, that's what we normally do anyway, but I mean, just some of the photos I looked at, there was no area of more than maybe half a square foot that was the same color as whatever was adjacent to it. I mean, they were all just shades of, you know, some shade of olive drab, but the fading brought out browns, it brought out yellows, it brought out just all sorts of colors, darker colors, lighter colors. And then, of course, you know, there was damage to the paint, there was scratches, there was all sorts of stuff. So if you're looking for a subject that's a World War II aircraft that you can really go to town on the weathering on, pick something that served in the Southwest Pacific, because they really, really did get beat up. So let me get this layer on here. Now, when examining historical photos, one of the things that I noticed was there were just little tiny splotches all over. So to try and simulate this, I'm going to take some of this Vallejo Model Color Beige, and I put in just a brush full of the Brownish Green that I had previously used. And what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to get this big fat brush like this, and I've thinned it down pretty heavily with water. And I'm just going to do the speckling method like this to just introduce that spotting on there. Just splotch it up. Now, if it's going on too opaque, you're probably too opaque for your tastes. It probably needs to be thinned some more, because you'll notice on this side it goes on fairly opaque over here, but then on this side, as it's drying, the color is much less intense. All right, and you can see how that looks. It's quite beat up looking. And I'll go put a thin layer of the olive drab base back over this just to blend it. There'll be other steps that I'll take later on after the decals are on to further distress the paint, but this is just a good base to get everything else over. All right, I put on the blending coat, and you can see how that looked. As I've talked about, I think in this video at other times, it's very subjective. Whatever you think is the right amount of blending is the right amount of blending. Factoring in that if later on, if you're going to do more filters, oil dot filters, airbrush effects, whatever effects you're going to put over it, all of those are going to tone this down. So, you know, the more you've done it, the more you'll have a better feel for what you can get away with, I guess you'd say. But you won't know till you try it. So if I had to suggest anything, lean more towards blending it out too much than not enough, because if you don't do it enough and you get to the end and too much of those effects are showing through too starkly, you may not like it. But if they're more subtle, then you kind of see, okay, here's kind of the level of what I need to do for this. Now it's time to take off the masking. So as I have talked about, I'll just start pulling it back against itself very slowly and hope that the primer and the paint were well cured when I put the tape on them. All right, I can live with this. This works. It's mostly the way I want it to look. And if you are asking, well, what do you mean mostly? I don't know that I've ever done any model where at the end it fully met my expectations that I saw in my head, in my brain. But that's okay. This will definitely do for government work. All right, off camera, I gave the model a gloss coat, and just in preparation for the decals, just to have a nice smooth surface so that everything will go down nicely. Now for the gloss coat, I used Vallejo gloss varnish. I usually use, I've still got several bottles of Pledge floor polish, which is an acrylic gloss. I just decided to use this. I've got this sitting around, and I thought, well, let me use it. And worked fine. I mean, it goes on, doesn't look much different than if I put on my Pledge. So, if you're opposed to using, I know some folks are just opposed to using floor polish type products on their models. They say, well, I need to use a proper modeling product. Well, this is one that worked pretty good for me. So I'm ready to do some decals. I'll start with putting one of these U.S. national markings on the underside. They were only on the left wings as you viewed them. So let me get this cut out with my mostly sharp X-Acto knife. Now I always check decals to see how much of the carrier film is around, how much sticks out. On these, it's not too much. It's not too bad, so I'm not going to worry about it. If there's a lot, sometimes I'll go in and cut away the excess, but with this, there's not too much. I like to use these forceps clamp thingy to hold the decal. I try to leave enough sticking off to give me a little grab handle. Got a piece of paper towel here, and off camera I've got a coffee cup warmer with a coffee cup full of warm water. How warm is it? As warm as coffee. That's, fairly simple. So it works well with decals. It's not too hot. You can use cold water. It just takes the decals a lot longer to get loose from the backing paper and things like that if you're using cold water, in my experience. So I like using the coffee warmer. So I'm going to put it over in the coffee water, and I'm going to keep talking while I'm doing this so that you'll kind of get an idea of how long I leave it in the coffee water. And that should be just about right for most high quality decals. And then I just set it there, and I'll let it sit for a minute. And I'm going to, in the meantime, grab out my micro set, which is a setting solution. It's what you put on the model before the decal. You don't have to use something like this. Some people just use water. I've used water. I've used Future floor polish or some kind of gloss. Sometimes if the surface is glossy enough and there's not too much of a chance of silvering, I don't even use this stuff. I'll just put it on like that. It'll spread out underneath it. And then I'll take my decal and I'll make sure that it's loose. Yep, it's nice and loose. And I'll just slide it off of there like that. And then if I can slide it with my finger to position it, I will. But I usually do any final adjustments with the tip of my knife. Now, that's living dangerously, I'll admit that. You may want to use like one of these rubber sculpting tools. Some people use a brush, things like that. But let me pull this up close to my face so I can see it, double check the positioning, and then I'll show you what I do next. All right, I can live with that positioning. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a Q-tip, and well, I said I could live with that positioning, but now I'm looking at it and I'm not liking it. So let me make another quick adjustment. There we go. I make another quick adjustment, and what I do is I lightly push in and then I roll to the outer edge. And what I'm doing is I'm moving that liquid out from underneath, but I'm trying to do it in such a way that I don't misalign, misposition the decal. I want to try and keep it where it's at. Once I've got most of the water worked away, I just do this a little more just to try and squeegee out any bubbles, anything that could make the decal, the decal, the sticker look less than smooth. Now, sometimes you just can't get 100% of it out, so I don't worry about it because I can deal with it later. Now, once I have that on, I take some Solvaset, Walther's Solvaset. There are other setting solutions. There are lots of, or decal softeners. There are lots of them on the market. I've tried a lot of brands. I've never found anything that for me works better than Solvaset. There are some of the ones that, like from Gunza, that I've tried that seem a little too hot to use on many of the aircraft decals that I've done, because that's most of, I mean, on practically every airplane you ever build, it's going to have decals. Not every sci-fi subject will. But I like Solvaset. Most decals, even though it's fairly hot, most decals have no trouble with it, especially good quality ones. But I put it on one very wet coat and I leave it. I get just a little over the edge and I leave it, because at this point, if I start trying to reposition the decal or try to spread more on, it's softened up the decal enough that it may smear like paint. So once it's on there, leave it. Now, when it's drying, when you're using Solvaset and some other setting solutions, they may wrinkle up and they may look really ugly. Give them time. Within a few hours, they should settle back out and be really nice. You do have to be careful of, for some decals, if there's open space in them. For example, hold on, let me refocus this. If a decal has open spaces in it, like in the middle of the U or the S or the R, there's carrier film there. Now, you can cut it away, but it can make the decal much more difficult to deal with. So you'll have to decide whether you want to do that. And there's like carrier film between these. So again, you may want to just cut them all into separate parts, but then you got to be very concerned about the spacing. But air bubbles can appear under here. And that's where the silvering comes in. So that's where it's important to make sure you get down a good, number one, a good gloss coat will help address that. A good setting solution like Microset or something like that will help prepare the surface, and then getting the Solvaset. But even after that, sometimes you may have to make slices in the carrier film and put in more Solvaset that penetrates into that. So be very aware of bubble and air management underneath this carrier film when you're doing one of these decals like this. Sometimes I'll even, if I see any bubbles or anything that form underneath any silvering, I'll even just touch it up with paint. Just cover it up, you know. So be aware of that when you're applying these. But I'm going to get the rest of these decals that are specific to the airplane, and then there's a few stencils that I'm going to get on there. So I'll get those on there and show you how that looks. The decals are on, and looks pretty cool, I think. I like the nose art there. Simple, but kind of funny. Tail numbers, national markings, a few stencils around on the wings and fuselage. There's one there, one right up there, here, a few other places like that. Note that they had these red markers indicating not to walk up here, and I got the wing walks too wide, so that because the decals originally supplied a black area for the wing walk, but I don't like the way wing walks look when they're decals. They just look like decals. So I put that on. It's supposed to go all the way to the edge there. So all I'll do is I'll just use some red paint and just touch that up to take it all the way to the edge. And after all the later effects and stuff like that, it really won't be noticeable. Or at least that's what I tell myself. Now, of course, I'd put setting solution on all of the decals. And in fact, what I did was I did these yesterday morning. I filmed these yesterday morning, and then last night when I got home from work, I did the rest of them. And then after I got done with all of them, and the Solvaset that I'd originally put up here had kind of dried up, and the decals were workable again, I went around the whole thing and put on another coat of Solvaset. But what I want to do now, if you'll notice, there's panel lines that go through many of the decals. And quite often I see modelers will hit it with setting solution and depend on that to sink it into the panel lines. But then when they put on their washes, you'll often see that the wash won't stay in those panel lines because, of course, the decals take up part of it, and there's just not that much room. Plus, there's a few other things I need to think about, like over here, there's the shell ejection chutes. That's hard to say. And a few other things that I want to deal with. Plus, I want to look for any signs of potential silvering that might be there. So I want to take some steps to deal with that. Now, for where the decal goes over the panel lines, all I do is I very carefully take an X-Acto knife and I just lightly pull it through there where the panel lines are. Get it down in the groove, and I try to pull it parallel to the panel line and have my knife aligned parallel to the panel line. Just makes it easier. Occasionally I stray off course and cut the decal, but generally when I put some setting solution back on it, that takes care of it. If it doesn't, I can either correct it with paint, or that's where the chipping is going to go. I just do this anywhere panel lines cross the decal, and it does several things. It allows the wash to go in there when I later put on a wash, but also you may notice that in some of these panel lines there's a little bit of silvering going on already. Well, this just takes care of that and helps eliminate that. And then here where these shell ejection chutes are, just going to cut them out. I don't worry about being too complete about it, because when I put on the setting solution, or the decal solution rather, the decal solvent, I guess you'd say, it's going to take care of that. But this I just noticed I got that one kind of crooked. Oh well, I'll live. But I just go through and cut those like that. And then, like I notice on this one, it just seems like it's not quite getting with the program. I want to see the panel line. See how the difference is? You can see the panel line there. That way I'll know that when a wash goes in, it's going to take to it fairly well. Now what I do is I go back to my solva set and I just paint over the panel lines like that. And then I'm going to paint over there where the shell ejection chutes are. And that should really get that sunk in there. One little thing I did forget to mention, that was carrier film between the U and the S. And what I did is after the decal was on there and after I'd worked all the water out, but before I put any solva set on it, I actually took my knife and just lightly scored it along there and just pulled up that piece of carrier film that was between those letters. So you can do that. It's kind of living dangerously because you're cutting the decal right on the model. But I've done it before and I kind of, felt comfortable with it. So, but it's something you can consider. All right, and you can now see how that looks. I don't know how well it'll show up on camera, but it looks much better to my eye. And then on the underside, there's that area. Now, as I'm filming this, it's fairly early in the morning. I'm a very early riser who likes to hit the camera. And you can see that there. And I've got to go to work in a little while. So what I'll do is let this dry, let that solva set dry. And when I get home this evening, I'll just check it one more time. I'll probably just go ahead and just slice through all of them again and put some more on again. Just because, one, it won't hurt anything, and two, it'll just make sure that everything looks hopefully pretty good. Now, off camera, what I'll do is once I'm completely done with the panel lines and slicing through them and putting on solva set, and I'm happy with that, I'll give the model a final gloss coat. I like to do that so that it seals in the decals. One of the primary reasons I like sealing in the decals is not just to protect them, because the stuff that I use over probably won't hurt the decals. That's not the issue. But what can happen is, let's say up here along the nose art, let's say I got, I don't know it because you really can't see it, but maybe underneath some of this white area, there's a bubble. Well, if I'm putting washes over that and it finds a little crack, it will run into that crack and into that bubble underneath there and make a really dark patch under there. Or the same way with, say, the white stars or something like that. So sealing up the model with an additional gloss coat is as much about protecting the decals in general as it is specifically sealing them up so that washes and things don't get underneath them and create effects that you don't want. I will be doing weathering over the decals because obviously on any aircraft from this era, any aircraft, the markings get weathered along with the paint. They may weather a little differently depending on how they were applied, but they get weathered nonetheless. So I'll go ahead and call this a video. In the next episode, I'll have it a final gloss coat, and I'll start the panel lining, detail painting, weathering, chipping, all of those things that I'll do to finish this off, and putting on all the extra bits and pieces and getting all that finished up. And hopefully in the next episode I'll finish it up, but I've gotten to where I just, I film, and when I get to somewhere in the 40 minutes to an hour-ish range, then I just go ahead and wrap it up. And I know I'm not going to finish it in any reasonable amount of time at this point, so I'll just call this a video. Well, every now and then I like to have a little fun with the videos. So if you are here watching at the end, and I am grateful that you're watching all the way to the end, let's have a little fun and riff off of the nose art. And if you would, and somewhere in your comment, just put quack, quack. Quack, quack. People will wonder, what the heck is that about? So, but we'll know, and we'll have a laugh. So anyway, you know the deal. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. And I hope that in whatever your project you're working on, that you're having fun with it. And if you're not, look for the fun. Look for the fun in it. And maybe step back, give it a little time. And after a while, come back and see if it's grown on you a little bit. So anyway, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.